you, Chair, Co-Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good day to you all. Firstly, I want to start by thanking the organizing committee for extending an invite to me to come here from South Africa. This year is actually 150 years in the country since the first arrival of Indians there. So the whole year has been full of pomp, glory, celebrations, because South Africa and India indeed share a very common heritage. One of which is on traditional medicines, the experiences of which I am going to share with you today. Now certainly, with regards to traditional medicines and Ayurveda, in South Africa we have not just Ayurvedic forms of healing, but we have African traditional medicines. We have traditional healers that also play a huge role in public health with regards to male circumcision, to advising and health promotion activities with respect to HIV, AIDS, TB, and so forth. So I think in the context of this presentation, think about Ayurveda not actually only being an aspect or a discipline used to treat disease, but I think our Ayurvedic physicians can play a much larger role to actually promote public health, health promotion, to assist in screening. I mean, in India, there's a huge problem with cervical cancer, but to also train our Ayurvedic practitioners to assist with cervical cancer screening can really play a huge role and alleviate some of the burdens that we face in our public sector hospitals. So when we look at traditional medicines and public health, last night I've been going through the book of abstracts, and one could see that there are a number of different disciplines that are covered by Ayurveda, from oral health, women and child health, reproductive health, all the way down to cancer. Now, some of these diseases are treatable, some of them are actually preventable, many of them are actually lifestyle induced. So certainly our physicians can play a huge role in health promotion, screening, and in treatment. With respect to South Africa, between 2006 and 2008, we could see an increase in the number of visits by patients to our hospitals for chronic care. Similarly, we've seen an increase in our number of patients being diagnosed with hypertension, diabetes mellitus as well. We're seeing this condition more frequently now in children because of the sedentary lifestyle that our children now lead. And if we look at the death rate per 100,000 in our population, we can see that in females, there's an increase of asthma, lung-related disorders, breast cancer, cervical cancer. And in males, we see somewhat of a steady rate of death with respect to the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, certainly, I think Ayurveda can play a huge role, but at the same time, there are a large number of questions that have to be dealt with, have to be answered for both regulatory aspects, for the consumers at large, as our previous speakers have alluded to. Now in South Africa, we have about 30,000 species that are largely endemic, but only about 3,000 species are actually used as medicines. With respect to HIV, there are about 5 million South Africans that are infected. We have about 500,000 of our citizens infected with TB. And now with the HIV-TB co-infection, it's running rampant in the country. And if something is not done about it, and some sort of an integrated approach is not sought, then certainly we are going to have a public health crisis looming. Now, if we look at India, we look at South Africa, and yesterday your Chief Minister also pledged his full support for this Congress. We can see that with respect to traditional medicines, there's a long history of traditional medicine use. There is certainly political interest, both South Africa and in India. And certainly we have a lot of trained staff, both here in your science councils like the CSIR, the RLHT, and also at universities. And because of the growth in our scientific understanding and the development of science and technology, we also have available in vitro and in vivo testing systems. And finally, we do recognize traditional medicines as an economic driver. So certainly the environment is really conducive to this sort of work. But then why? Why then is there so much of public health confusion? Well, it's simple. You all are here because you all believe in Ayurveda. But not everybody believes in it, because people are looking for evidence. We are scientists and we are here to explore. We are here to explore, discuss and debate issues related to Ayurveda so that we can bring and put forward to the rest of the public the best evidence. So people are asking, well, where is the evidence? Can you show it to me that supports whether or not a particular product has efficacy against a particular disease? And secondly, how is the evidence obtained? These are the two burning issues. And if we don't start to address it now, then 10 years from now, 100 years from now, we are still going to be faced with the same problem of not being able to answer as to where the evidence was actually obtained. So certainly, indigenous knowledge plus evidence-based knowledge equals best practice. Now, when we look at traditional medicines, let's go back 100 years ago. The first undertakings were of an ethnobotanical nature. And then subsequently came the scientists, the chemists. They began to do a lot of pharmacology, phytochemistry. They began to isolate these molecules from plants, then synthesize it, and then the pharma industry developed. But what happened on the other side? The aspects related to plant medicine's use dropped. So what we are saying is that, fine, it's good to go and isolate these active principles and to study them and see how they work. It's good, it's necessary for achieving the long-term goals of identifying these actives. But this sort of research is certainly not going to meet the acute public health needs on safety and efficacy that we need now. Some of the questions that our regulatory bodies continuously raise, and they certainly have a case for an argument. For example, the intentional addition of active drugs responsible for the therapeutic effect. This has been known, it's been documented, it's been found out, it happens. Unintentional substitution of plants with toxic species. We have many traditional healers, sometimes they may get confused with the type of plant material is being used, and they may substitute with a toxic species. This has been documented. We live in trying times. We have climatic changes, we have use of pesticides, environmental contamination of the plant with chemicals, and pathogens may occur. What about the suboptimal and varying amounts of the actives within these plants? Is there batch-to-batch variability, or are the batches that are consistently being produced reproducible in terms of the effect that they're meant to give? These are some of the aspects that the regulatory bodies are asking. Not to mention adverse effects. Is there enough pharmacovigilance with respect to Ayurveda? What about drug-herb interactions? This certainly we heard earlier in the first session about drug-herb interactions, especially with St. John's wort, and also about the confounding factors that could lead to misinterpretation of effect. So these are some of the aspects that are being asked continuously, and we need to take cognizance of this. Okay? So, I'm here to talk to you about epidemiology. How then can we use this aspect of science to bring evidence base to the fore? Randomized clinical trials. Many of you, I'm sure, at some point would have submitted a protocol to an ethics committee to undertake a randomized clinical trial of an Ayurvedic product. The type of questions that are asked by ethics committees for these type of studies are sometimes irrelevant. Irrelevant in a sense that they are not questions designed to look at polyherbals, but rather single entities or combination products of which the chemical compounds are actually known. So with epidemiology, what we do is that we study how often these diseases occur in different groups of people and why. Similarly, the adverse is, or the opposite is true, in that we are able to assess whether or not patients who take Ayurvedic products are more likely to have a better outcome or perhaps a worse outcome than those that don't or take the equivalent. And we believe that through epidemiology, we can certainly help overcome the knowledge deficits implicit in the concerns related to plant-based therapeutics. Now, what are some of the type of studies that we can undertake with regards to epidemiology? On your right-hand side, we have the experimental studies. Let's forget about that for now. We are not going to talk about randomized clinical trials. Let's leave that aside. Let's look to the left side of your screen and let's look at observational studies. the two types of studies that are most important that we can actually use to bring evidence of Ayurveda to the fore is the case control and the cohort studies. And these studies can be designed in such a manner that you could also apply scientific rigor and address whether or not these plant medicines are safe and efficacious. Now, when we look at the evidence-based pyramid, certainly if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, the base of the pyramid, we have the in vitro, or what we call the test tube research. And then from there we move on to animal models and so forth. But as we move up the pyramid, you could see the case series, the case control studies, cohort studies are absolutely important. Certainly randomized clinical double-blind trials are absolutely important, okay? But the kind of hurdles that we have to cross to get there are far too many right now. And certainly we need to focus on the case series, case control studies, and cohort studies. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that the single studies are certainly unlikely to convince skeptics, but an increasing body of evidence. So let's look and see, what does a case control study mean? Okay, we can go back retrospectively, where we can take a group or a population that is exposed particularly to an Ayurvedic product within a population group, and those that are not exposed. And in these two groups, or rather in one group where there is a disease and one group where there isn't a disease, okay? And we can see in these groups whether or not, if they have taken an Ayurvedic product as exposed or not exposed, and look at the prevalence of the outcome in each of these groups. Okay, the good thing about this study is that we can go back retrospectively, all right? We don't have to wait for a long period of time to actually acquire data, okay? And what is also good about it is that we can take a single case or a single disease and look at multiple products. We don't have to look at one disease, one product, but a single disease and multiple products. The idea and the trick here is to involve our Ayurvedic physicians in such studies, because the definition of a case in such studies is absolutely important and might vary from the type of definition that is used in Western medicine. So the precise criteria that as defined by the Ayurvedic physician is absolutely critical. So they should actually be involved in this particular aspect of studies. The inclusion criteria is also important as to whether you're studying men, women, you're studying children, you're studying a particular age group, or you're studying a population within a specific community. These are all predefined criteria that need to be set out in your protocol, which adds scientific rigor. The other type of study which I will briefly mention is a cohort study. Here what we are doing is that we are prospectively observing people over time. So we can take people who don't have the disease and follow them up and look at it in conjunction with people who actually get a disease, and see on whether or not those that don't have the disease, whether or not they've been taking Ayurvedic medicines. So we can look at the prevalence of the disease in those that are exposed and not exposed prospectively. So we follow them up over time. The good thing about such a type of study is that we can look at many diseases. We can look at many diseases with a single product. The case control, we look at a single disease, multiple products, and that's the idea. Your cohort, where if you look at your screen, just to show you where it says people without the disease, it could be people that are taking the medicine, it could be people that share some sort of a similar attribute, and that is what defines your cohort. We heard in the previous session about herb-drug interactions, all right? We really can't study herb-drug interactions all that much if we don't know what the actives are, by which mechanisms they actually show their efficacy, okay, in biological systems. So what we can do in such studies is have what we call a case-only design. In this study, where we actually take all the individuals that are diseased, we can then split them up into two groups. We can give one a single medicinal product and allow the others to take either dual products or multiple products, and look at the outcome in these two groups. And in that, so you can see that in such studies, it is actually outcomes oriented. Yes, it's important academically to go and understand why or what molecule by what mechanism it's bringing about its action, what it's breaking down to, what the metabolites are. But at the end of the day, the average person out there wants to know if they take a product, will they be able to have a good quality of life? The other aspects about academically trying to find out mechanisms of action is really purely of an academic nature. The average person wants to know whether the product can work for them. So these three studies are absolutely critical, and I think they can actually fast forward bringing about evidence base to the fore. Obviously, the observed data that we see is a combination of the truth plus bias. Now, the bias is what we call systematic error, okay, and that's why it's very important to have your protocol done in a manner that reduces bias, because if you undertake a study that is incorrect in some way, it's impossible to correct it at the end. And then there's random error, which is error due by chance and chance alone. And also the final effect, what authorities ask is that, is the outcome that you see really a result of the exposure or the people taking the medicine, or is it because of some other factor that we haven't brought into our equation? So confounding is absolutely critical, and once again in this type of studies we can actually look at confounding and actually try and minimize or alleviate this aspect. Now, why do you want to do clinical trials with Ayurveda? Because a natural product, a natural experiment of huge dimensions has already started a long time ago. People are self-prescribing. Many products are being sold in markets. Many people consult Ayurvedic practitioners and traditional healers. So why now do we want to take a herbal product out of its natural setting and now clinically test it? Because one must understand that traditional medicines is not just a medicine. We've heard the previous speaker talk about mind, body, soul. It's not just a medicine, but it's given in the context of certain values, cultural and traditional, that are shared by both patients and healers alike. Okay, so we need to actually test these systems within the natural environment. And by doing these sort of studies, we can certainly access safety and efficacy in this natural setting. Certainly the history of long use, the assumption that natural products are safe. Okay, but we must remember that sometimes being natural is not always safe, and there could be adverse effects over long term which we may not be able to underpin related to Ayurvedic products or traditional medicines. So the lack of acute toxicity does not really equal chronic toxicity. Okay, and finally, with respect to the appraisal of studies, okay, ethics committees, the public wants to know, did the study that you've done address critical, a clearly focused issue? Did the authors actually use the appropriate methods to answer the question? And also whether the cohort was actually recruited in an acceptable way. I've spoken to you about the cases, the definition of the case, and how you're going to measure the exposure is just as important. Okay? And whether or not the follow-up was actually for a long time or not. Okay, I'm going to just skip through a few slides very quickly, but just to show you, in South Africa, this is the typical traditional healer, a traditional medicine practitioner. We call them Inyangas, but we also have traditional birth attendants, midwives, and so forth that can also assist in alleviating public health. The government is certainly come to the fore and has welcomed traditional medicines, and you can see that there's a lot of move to integrate traditional medicines into Western medicine. And in 2008, we contributed to the development of a draft policy on African traditional medicines, and this policy was designed to actually provide a framework for institutionalizing traditional medicines and to establish an African Traditional Medicines Institute. And I just want to conclude then by saying that knowledge of safety and efficacy must be shown for public consumption. That is we cannot deviate from that. We are living in a knowledge-based society. People are becoming more and more knowledgeable. The internet is out there. People are asking these questions, and we need to provide the evidence. Clinical trials are virtually non-existent, and therefore well-designed case-control studies, cohort studies can make significant contributions to the immediate need for evaluation of safety and efficacy. And thereafter, we can go back to the laboratory and we can test these products for in vitro efficacy. I want to acknowledge the Rockefeller Foundation, the Medical Research Council of South Africa, the Department of Science and Technology, both in India and South Africa, because we have an Indo-SA bilateral agreement, and also the Federation of the Indian Council for Commerce and Industry. On that note, I want to thank you all for your attention.